The alien princess leaned close. "You will be the father of my children," she whispered. Adam Nowitzki heard it the way a man hears thunder at the very moment the lightning strikes. Too late to brace, too loud to ignore, too strange to be real. He had been staring at the wall when she said it. Not the wall of the holding chamber, smooth, jointless, humming faintly at a frequency just below the threshold of human hearing, but somewhere else. The wall inside his head, the one he'd been building brick by brick since Marta died, since the car left the road, since the sound of rain on broken glass became the last sound he associated with the word love. 17 months ago, or if the Keth Solari were to be believed, 1,032 years from now. Both felt equally impossible. Her name, she had told him, was Irea Vasdone, which translated roughly, through the translation node latched behind his left ear, as she who arrives before the signal. She was the third daughter of the matriarch conductor of the Keth Solari Orbital Consortium, and she stood approximately 2 meters tall, with a bioluminescent ridge running from her hairline down the bridge of what might generously be called a nose. Her eyes were amber and triple-lensed. She smelled of ozone and something sweeter underneath, like a garden after lightning. She did not look like a princess. She looked like something a painter might dream after a fever. Adam was a painter, had been. His brushes were in a storage box at his sister's apartment in Warsaw, wrapped in a cloth that still smelled like Marta's studio. He hadn't touched them since. He turned from the wall and looked at Irea properly. "I'm sorry," he said. The translation node hummed. "Could you repeat that?" She repeated it, word for word, leaning in again, her triple-lensed eyes resolving him in wavelengths he could not imagine, her voice low and without affect. "You will be the father of my children." He opened his mouth, then closed it, then said, "I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of this operation." He had been taken 11 days ago. Or so he calculated based on sleep cycles, because there was no natural light in the Keth Solari transit vessel, and his phone had been gently removed, along with his jacket, his wallet, and a half-eaten bar of dark chocolate, shortly after he regained consciousness. He had not been harmed. He wanted to be precise about that in his own mind because it seemed important. They had not been cruel. The chamber was warm. The food was unfamiliar but nutritious, delivered through a panel in the wall with a small chime like a doorbell. There was something that functioned like a bed. There was something that functioned like a shower, though the fluid it used was not quite water and left his skin faintly iridescent for an hour afterward. There had been interactions. The tall ones, the Keth Solari, ivory-ridged, amber-eyed, came and went in pairs, and they looked at him with an expression he kept trying to name. Not curiosity, not hostility. The closest he could get was the expression on the face of a restoration specialist when they first unroll a painting suspected to be a lost original. That combination of clinical assessment and barely suppressed wonder. They had given him the translation node on day 2. A Keth Solari technician, compact and precise, had approached with the device pinched between 2 fingers and held it toward him with both hands, the way you might offer something fragile. "For speaking," she had said, in heavily accented Polish. She had clearly learned the word specifically for this moment and was proud of it. "Thank you," Adam had said. She had nodded, very fast, 3 times, which the node would later teach him was the Keth Solari equivalent of a pleased exhale, and left. The node's translation was imperfect. It rendered nuance approximately, meaning it caught about 70% of an exchange and interpolated the rest. This was, according to Irea, considered exceptional for a species at humanity's developmental stage. She did not say this unkindly. She said it the way you might say a child is doing very well with its letters. Adam found this enraging. He filed the rage neatly behind the wall and got on with it. After Irea's pronouncement, he was moved to a different room. This one had a window. He stood at it for a long time without moving. Outside being a word that barely applied, a word that his brain was using because it had no better equipment, was a structure of impossible scale. Rings within rings, each one rotating at a different speed, each one studded with lights that pulsed in patterns he could not decode. Between the rings, vessels moved, dozens of them, hundreds. Some were the size of ships, some were the size of cities. And beyond all of it, small and pale and unmistakable, was Earth. He pressed his hand flat against the glass. It was warm. "How long?" he said to the empty room. The node translated automatically, broadcasting to whatever sensors were embedded in the walls. A Kethsolari technician he hadn't seen before appeared at the door. She consulted something on a device that looked like a stack of paper made of light. 11 of your days in transit from planetary surface. 41 of your days since the consortium first identified your signal. He turned from the window. "What signal?" She looked at the light paper. "Your creative output, the resonance pattern of your work." She paused, seeming to search for the right interpolation. "The consortium monitors species of the developmental stage for what your translation matrix is rendering as harmonic signature, the art you make, the music your species produces, the specific neural patterning of creative intelligence." She set down the light paper. "Yours is exceptional, statistically outside normal variance for your species." Adam stared at her. "You abducted me because I paint. We invited you. I was in my apartment, in Warsaw, asleep." The invitation was non-verbal. She picked up the light paper again as if this settled the matter. "The princess will explain further. She requested to do so herself." She left. Adam sat on the edge of what functioned as a bed and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. In the dark behind his eyelids he saw Marta's face. He always did in the dark. Not the last version of her face, the one from the hospital, gray and beyond reach. The earlier one. The face she made when she looked at one of his paintings. Not the finished ones, the in-progress ones, half-rendered, and said something she believed without needing to verify it. She used to say, "You make the unreal feel true." "That's rarer than you think, Adam. Most people do the opposite." He hadn't painted since she died. He'd stopped believing the unreal could be made to feel like anything. He lowered his hands and looked at Earth through the window, small and bright and impossibly far away. "Right," he said, to nobody in particular. Irea Vast Dome was not what he expected a princess to be. She worked. That was the first surprise. When she met with him the following morning, morning being another word he was using because he had no other, she was mid-conversation with 3 technicians, standing over a table of light paper while making rapid adjustments with both hands. She held up 2 fingers when she saw him, the Kethsolari gesture for one moment, and finished what she was doing before turning. She was wearing something that looked like a work uniform. There were ink analog stains on her left wrist. "You're an engineer," he said, before the translation node had even settled. "Architect of systems," she said. "The title is political, the work is technical." She gestured toward chairs that had been arranged near the window. "Please." He sat. She sat across from him, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees, which was apparently a posture of serious intent in Kethsolari body language. He would learn this later. For now, it just made her seem unexpectedly human, and that made him trust her slightly more than he planned to. "Yesterday you said something to me," he said. "I'd like to understand what you meant." "Yes," she didn't look away. Her triple-lensed eyes, he was beginning to understand, did not blink the way human eyes did. They processed continuously, which meant she was always fully present in a way that felt both more and less comfortable than normal conversation. "I will explain, but I need you to understand the context first. If I begin with the statement, you will not have the frame for it." "Try me anyway." Her mouth made an expression he didn't have a name for yet. It might have been respect. "The Kethsolari reproduce through what you would call genetic election. Our biology is not self-fertilizing. The matriarch caste, of which I am a member, selects a genetic partner based on harmonic compatibility. Compatibility is not assessed physically. It is assessed by creative resonance. She paused. The theory, which is very old, is that the most sophisticated minds are those capable of rendering the internal world externally. The capacity to make what is felt into what is real. To translate the language of the self into a language others can receive. Adam said nothing. Your harmonic signature, Araya continued, is the highest we have recorded from your species in 200 of your years. Not technical intelligence, we have found many of those. Not linguistic precision, the specific capacity to hold grief and beauty simultaneously and make something from both. That is exceptionally rare. She looked at him steadily. I am not being poetic. This is the scientific assessment. He thought about Marta again, what she used to say. I haven't painted in 17 months, he said. We know. I'm not sure I'm going to again. We know that too, she leaned back slightly. That is actually why the timing is now and not later. You are currently at maximum harmonic tension. A resonance pattern at its most charged is also at its most fragile. We could not wait. He looked at her. That's a very clinical way to describe grief. Yes. For the first time her voice changed in a way that the node rendered as something other than information. I am sorry for your loss, I mean that. The Kethsolari have lost too. We understand its weight. He believed her. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't try to make it smaller. The courtship, if that was the right word, which he doubted, was unlike anything he had a framework for. There were no dinners, no long walks, no slowly escalating moments of romantic tension. What there was instead was work. Araya showed him what she was building. She brought him into the construction bays, enormous pressurized chambers, where Kethsolari technicians were assembling something whose function he spent 3 days failing to understand before she explained it. A perceptual bridge, she said. They were standing on an observation gantry above the primary construction floor. Below them, the structure spread out like a cathedral of light and metal. The human term that comes closest is empathy engine. It takes the internal experience of one mind, the full texture of it, not just the surface thoughts but the underlying weight, and translates it into a form another mind can receive. Telepathy. No, telepathy implies direct transfer. This is translation. The way your translation node renders language imperfectly, approximately, but enough. The same principle applied to experience. She looked down at the construction below. The consortium has been trying to build this for 300 years. We have the engineering. We have always had the engineering. What we have never had is the key. What's the key? She looked at him. The key is a mind that already knows how to do it. She paused. What you do when you paint. You translate the internal into the external so precisely that other minds that have never experienced what you experienced, feel it as if they had. That is not a common skill. It is, in fact, the exact function the bridge needs to complete its calibration. He stared at her, then he looked at the structure below, then he looked back at her. You want me to teach a machine how to feel? We want your mind to tell us how it does what it does. Yes. And the other thing you said, about children. She met his gaze without flinching. Kethsolari genetic election is irrevocable once initiated. The matriarch conductor has sanctioned my selection. It is not a request I can withdraw without dishonor to my house. She paused. I understand this is extraordinary for you. I understand your customs do not work this way. I am not asking you to act immediately. I am asking you to understand the stakes. The stakes being that if you help us complete the bridge, the Kethsolari Consortium, which controls trade, transit, and resource access for 47 inhabited systems, will recognize humanity as a sovereign intelligence. Your species will be introduced to the Concordat. You will not be alone anymore. She let that settle. And if you refuse, if you return to Earth, we will leave. We will file your species as pre-emergent and non-viable. You will not hear from us again." Adam was quiet for a long time. Below them, the empathy engine hummed with patient, alien purpose. "I need," he said finally, "to think about this." "Yes," she said. "I know." He thought about it the way he used to approach a difficult painting, by not thinking about it directly. He asked for materials. The Kethsolari provided them without question, pigments in colors he'd never seen before, substrates that held paint differently than any canvas he'd worked with, brushes made of something that responded to pressure like good sable but smelled of the sea. He set up in the corner of his room, near the window with the view of Earth, and he stood there for a long time with a brush in his hand before he touched the substrate. He painted Marta. Not her face, not any recognizable representation. He painted the feeling of her, the specific weight of the 3 years they'd had together, the way Saturday mornings had felt, the smell of her particular coffee, the sound she made when she was reading something that surprised her. He painted the 17 months since, too, the silence in the apartment, the half-finished canvases he'd turned to face the wall, the way grief changes shape but doesn't diminish, how it becomes part of the architecture of you. He worked for 6 hours without stopping. When he finally stepped back, Irea was in the doorway. He didn't ask how long she'd been there. "The node renders visual art approximately," she said quietly. "My own perception of color is different from yours, but I can read the harmonic signature in what you're making." She paused. "It is, I don't have the word. The node will only give me beautiful. That is insufficient." He looked at the painting. "She was my wife," he said. "She died." "I know." "What am I doing here, Irea?" He meant it genuinely, not rhetorical. The real question. What am I doing here, on a station 1,000 years from when I'm supposed to be, talking to a bioluminescent alien architect who has decided to have my children, while the planet I grew up on floats outside the window like a marble someone dropped? She was quiet for a moment. Then she crossed the room and stood beside him, looking at the painting. "Do you know what the Kethsolari have never been able to do?" she said. "Not in 3,000 years of civilization. We can build anything. We can traverse the distance between stars. We can sustain life in vacuum. We can model the behavior of black holes, but we have never, not once in all our history, been able to hold grief and beauty in the same thought without one destroying the other." She turned to look at him. "We grieve, we create, but not at the same time. The moment our grief becomes sharp, our creative output stops. The moment we begin to create again, we have already moved past the grief. We have never found a way to stay in both at once." She gestured toward the painting. "You just did it, in 6 hours, with materials you've never worked with before." He looked at the painting, then back at her. "That's what the bridge needs," he said. "Yes. You need the calibration signal to hold contradiction." "Yes." He set down the brush. He hadn't realized until just now that his hands were shaking, not with fear, but with something that felt a great deal like being recognized. The particular vertigo of being seen accurately after a long time of being invisible. "Tell me more about how the bridge works," he said. She told him. Over the following days, she told him everything. The Kethsolari had been alone for a very long time. Not alone in the sense of physical isolation. The Concordat held 47 species in loose alliance, but alone in the sense of fundamental incomprehension. They communicated, they traded, they negotiated. But they did not understand each other, not truly, and the accumulation of that misunderstanding across 3 centuries had calcified into a dozen cold diplomatic standoffs, 8 ongoing resource disputes, and 3 conflicts that had cost lives and were still not resolved. The empathy bridge was not a luxury. It was a last attempt to build something that did not require agreement, only the experience of the other's truth. "We have been trying to fix the Concordat with engineering," Irea said. They were walking through the construction bay now, moving between the struts and nodes of the bridge's outer architecture. "The problem is not engineering. The problem is that engineering requires shared definitions, and we do not share definitions, we share words. We use the same words and mean different things, and nobody can tell the difference. Adam looked up at the structure around him. From inside, it was even more staggering. The scale of it, the precision, 47 separate input arrays, each calibrated to a different species' neural architecture, all converging toward a central chamber that was currently empty and waiting. The central chamber, he said, that's where the calibration source goes. Yes. And you need a mind that can hold contradiction as the signal source. A mind, or the record of a mind. The bridge does not require you to be inside it. It requires your harmonic pattern, the specific signature of your creative process, to teach the central algorithm how to function. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You are not a sacrifice. I want to be clear about that. You would contribute a reading. The reading would take several hours. After that, you are free to do whatever you choose, including go home. She met his eyes, including go home. But if I go home, the thing you said about humanity still stands. She didn't look away. If you go home, the consortium files the report. Your species is quarantined for development observation for another 2,000 years, maybe more. She paused. I am trying to be honest with you. I was not trained to be dishonest, and I find it does not suit me regardless of training. He looked at her for a long time. The children, he said. Something shifted in her expression, the first time he'd seen her look uncertain. That was not the opening I would have chosen, she said. I was advised to begin with the strategic context. I began instead with the truth, because the truth seemed more respectful, and I have found that respectful approaches, though initially more complicated, produce better outcomes. She paused. I may have miscalculated the delivery. Despite everything, despite all of it, Adam laughed. Not a large laugh. A small one, the kind that escapes before you can catch it. She watched him do it with an expression that the node rendered, tentatively, as wonder. I haven't laughed in a year and a half, he said. I know. How do you know things like that? Your harmonic signature includes temporal markers. I can read the shape of the last 17 months in your creative pattern the way you would read a scar. She tilted her head. I have been studying you for 41 days. I know your morning habits and your sleep cycles, and the fact that you hum the same 4-bar melody when you are anxious. I know that you talk to your wife as though she can hear you, though you do not believe in anything that would permit this. I know that you are braver than you think you are. He looked at her. That last one you can't know from a harmonic signature. No, she agreed. That one I assessed myself. There were other humans on the station. He found this out on the 4th day, when a Kethsolari technician, the compact, precise one who had given him the translation node, whose name he had learned was Sevira, brought him to a communal space he had not been shown before. And in the communal space was a woman sitting cross-legged on the floor with a device in her lap that looked like a half-disassembled radio, and the expression of someone who had been doing a difficult puzzle for a very long time. She looked up. She was maybe 50, gray-streaked hair cut practically short, wearing the same kind of neutral shipsuit the Kethsolari had provided Adam. She had the look of someone who spent a great deal of time thinking and a reasonable amount of time arguing. She said in English, "Oh good, another one." He said in Polish, "Sorry." She switched to Polish without a pause, which startled him. Another human. They collected you recently, yes. You still have the slightly stunned look. It fades after about a week. She set down the device. Dr. Adriana Kowalczyk. I was a xenolinguist at the University of Warsaw, which is relevant because I can confirm the Kethsolari translation technology is extremely good and still renders sarcasm at approximately 40% accuracy. He sat down on the floor across from her because there were no chairs, which was apparently a feature of this particular communal space. Adam Nowicki, painter. She looked at him with sudden sharp attention. Painter. They brought you for the harmonic signature assessment. Yes, you. Linguistic architecture. The bridge needs calibration in pattern recognition as well as emotional resonance. They needed someone who understands how meaning changes when it crosses from one system to another, how the same structure can mean opposite things depending on context. She picked up the device again, turned it over in her hands. I have been here for 4 months. There are 6 of us total, or we're 2 went home 2 weeks ago. They let you go home whenever you want. That is the part they are very honest about and the part that makes me more inclined to stay. She looked at him steadily. What did they tell you about what they need? He explained. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then the grief and beauty paradox. Yes, they have been trying to solve it for 3 centuries. Every species in the Concordat either feels or creates. The transition between the 2 states takes time, sometimes years. The Vathamara literally cannot produce art during periods of collective mourning. Their creative infrastructure goes silent. She set down the device again. And you're a painter who hasn't painted since your wife died. Yes. And you've apparently started again. She nodded toward the faint, iridescent shimmer on his forearm, the residue of the materials he'd been using. Yes. That, she said, is the most interesting thing I've heard in 4 months. She extended one hand, not for a handshake exactly, but palm upward, an offering. Tell me about the painting. He told her. She asked good questions, the kind that came from genuine curiosity rather than social maintenance. She was, he realized, someone who needed to understand things fully before she could move on from them, which was a quality he recognized because he shared it. The Ketsolari don't understand why humans make art while they're in the middle of grief, she said eventually. They think it's a coping mechanism, like a pressure valve. She shook her head. I've been trying to explain that it's not a valve, it's a language. When you can't say the thing out loud because the words for it don't exist, or because saying it out loud would make it too real, or because there's no one left to say it to, you make the thing instead. You build it. And then it exists outside you, and you can look at it, and it's still you, but it's also separate, and somehow that makes it possible to continue. Adam was very still. Yes, he said, that's exactly it. They can't do that. She gestured around the station, the Ketsolari, all 47 species in the Concordat. None of them can. They all developed in environments where grief was communal, processed collectively, resolved through ritual. The individual carrying grief alone and making something from it, that's a human-specific thing, maybe a product of how isolated our evolutionary history was. She paused. Or maybe it's a product of the fact that our languages are so imprecise that we had to invent alternative communication systems to say the things words couldn't hold. Are you saying art exists because human language is bad? She smiled for the first time. I'm saying art exists because no language is ever fully sufficient, and humans were confrontational enough about that insufficiency to build something else instead of accepting the gap. She picked up the device again, which is, when you think about it, a very human way to handle a problem. He thought about it. Yes, he said, I think it is. He met the others over the following 2 days. There was Thomas, an architect from Gdansk, who had been brought for structural intuition, the specific human capacity to perceive flaw before failure, to look at a load-bearing element and know from something other than calculation that it was wrong. There was Priya, an Indian classical musician who had been on the station for 6 months and was engaged in an ongoing collaborative project with Ketsolari sound engineers that had apparently produced something that made an entire corridor of technicians stop working and stand still for 11 minutes. There was Felix, a Congolese mathematician whose particular specialty was in the topology of grief, the mathematical modeling of how loss changes the shape of a consciousness over time, and who had a direct professional collaboration with Irea that Adam found both fascinating and slightly bewildering. She's brilliant, Felix said, of urea. This was over a meal that involved substances Adam had stopped interrogating and started simply eating. The engineering is genuinely extraordinary. What she can't do is predict how the bridge will behave under emotional conditions she hasn't personally experienced. So we model. I give her the mathematics of human emotional topology, and she maps it onto the bridge architecture. How long have you been here? 7 months, he shrugged, not unhappily. I go home every 3 months for 2 weeks. My daughter is 11. She thinks I work for an unusual government project. He paused. Which is, I suppose, accurate. Does it bother you, the deception? Felix thought about it seriously. I will tell her everything when she is older. She is brilliant, she will understand it. And what we are building here, he gestured upward, toward where the bridge sat in the station's upper rings. What we are building here will be the reason that when she is an adult, her species is not alone in the universe. I find I can accept the temporary imprecision of the deception in exchange for that outcome. Adam thought about that. What will you tell her when you tell her? Felix was quiet for a moment. That her father spent a year helping aliens learn to feel what other people feel, and that the reason he could help was because humans are very, very good at suffering in ways that make something instead of just suffering. He picked up his food, which is not a comfortable thing to be good at, but better than the alternative. He spent the next 3 days with Adriana mostly. Not because they planned to, but because they kept finding themselves in the same corridors at the same times, which he eventually recognized as a feature of the Kethsolari station design. The communal spaces were positioned to encourage unscheduled contact between the human guests, a quiet social engineering that Sevira confirmed when he asked her directly. It was observed that humans who have other humans to talk to make faster progress on their assigned contributions, Sevira said, without a trace of apology. Also that humans who are isolated become preoccupied with worrying instead of working. That's manipulative, he said. Yes, she agreed, perfectly cheerfully. It is also effective. You began painting 3 days after meeting other humans. He had no response to this. Adriana was working on the bridge's pattern recognition array, the component that would allow the translated experiences to find their correct correspondence in an unfamiliar mind. She showed him her work one afternoon, spreading out light paper across the table and tracing the logic with her finger. The problem is metonymy, she said. In human language, we use a small part of something to stand for the whole, a crown for a king, a sail on the horizon for a ship. Your mind has learned to do this so efficiently that you've stopped noticing it, but the bridge has to be able to perform this substitution across species whose foundational metonyms are completely different. Avathamara's concept of home is rooted in scent, not visual architecture. A Kethsolari's concept of safety is a structural resonance frequency, not a location. If you translate the feeling of homesickness without first finding the correct metonym for the destination consciousness, you get white noise. So how do you solve it? You don't translate the content, you translate the function. She pointed to a section of the pattern array. Not this is what home feels like, but this is the function that home performs: warmth, known, safe, return to. Then let the destination mind supply its own content for those functions. She paused. The bridge will feel like a memory you didn't have. It will feel like your own past, except the events won't quite match your life, because the events are theirs. But the feelings are yours. He thought about what Irea had said about the Vathamara, about how the bridge had shown each pair the other's foundational grief, and they had understood each other's refusal to give ground. It didn't show them new information, he said slowly. It showed them the same information from a different angle. Yes, Adriana looked at him. Exactly, yes. You can tell someone about your pain and they will sympathize. You can show someone your pain and they will understand. The difference is the difference between a description of a fire and feeling warmth. He thought about painting, about how a good painting did not describe an emotion, it produced it. You stood in front of it, and the emotion occurred in you, not as something received but as something generated. As if the painting had handed you the instructions for a feeling you already contained. "I've been doing this my whole life," he said. "I just didn't know it was unusual." "That's how it usually works," said Adriana. "The things humans are most exceptionally good at are the ones they perform so automatically that it never occurs to them to consider it a skill." He said yes, not immediately and not without conditions. The conditions were his own, and Araya accepted them without negotiation, which he found either alarming or reassuring depending on which way he held it. The first condition was that he would complete the reading on his own terms, in his own time. He was not a calibration device. He was a person. If he was going to contribute the most intimate pattern of his interior life to a machine designed to bridge 47 species, he was going to do it consciously and with intention, not lying on a table while technicians took measurements. Araya agreed. The second condition was that he would be allowed to bring the Kethsolari materials back to Earth. Not the bridge itself, not any technology, just the pigments and the strange substrates that held paint differently. She looked at him for a moment. "You want to paint again?" "I think I might be ready." She agreed. The third condition was that no one would tell him what to expect from the reading. He would go in without a map. He had always worked better without a map. Araya agreed, but he caught something in her expression, the triple-lensed amber eyes cycling through a configuration he hadn't seen before. "What?" he said. "It is not a condition I would be able to refuse," she said carefully. "But I want to note the reading will be thorough. It will go to the parts of your mind that are currently walled off." She paused. "What you have been not thinking about for 17 months. The machine will need it, all of it." He understood. He said, "I know." They prepared the chamber for 3 days. During those 3 days, Araya and Adam continued to talk. He would not have predicted this, the talking. He would not have predicted finding her easy to be with, this tall, bioluminescent architect who had turned his life sideways. But there was a directness to her that he had not encountered in a long time. She did not perform. She did not manage distance. When she was uncertain, she said so. When something he said surprised her, she showed it. When she was amused, her bioluminescent ridge lit up slightly at the base, a little involuntary flicker she didn't seem to be aware of. He told her about Marta, not the clinical facts but the texture, the Saturday mornings, the way she organized her studio, everything labeled in her meticulous handwriting. The argument they'd had the night before the accident, stupid, inconsequential, the kind of argument that evaporates in a day, except they hadn't had the day. He had been carrying the unresolved weight of it for 17 months. Araya listened. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer the usual architectural repairs, the assurances that it wasn't his fault, the reminders that she'd known he loved her, the standard materials people use to fill holes they cannot actually fill. She just listened, and then she said, "In Kethsolari, there is a word Velthari which translates approximately as the things that remain unfinished not because we failed but because time refused us. We have a whole ceremony around Velthari, 3 days every 3rd year, where we do nothing but sit with those things and allow them to be unfinished." She paused. "Your species does not have this." "Not exactly." "It helps," she said, "not to finish them. Just to acknowledge that they are real and unfinished, and that is not the same as lost." He thought about that for a long time. He thought about Marta's handwriting on the labels in her studio. He had never gone back to that studio after the hospital. He had let her sister take what she wanted and then had the rest put into storage. He had never opened the storage unit. "Maybe when I get back," he said. "Yes," said Araya, "I think so." The reading took 4 hours and 19 minutes. He went in alone. The chamber was smaller than he expected, warm and dark and slightly curved, shaped like the inside of an eye. There were no straps, no restraints, no technician hovering with a clipboard. Just a single light above, and a surface that was smooth and comfortable and hummed at that same just below hearing frequency he'd been living with for 11 days. He lay down, he looked up at the light. The preparation took some time. Sevira had explained the process the previous evening with characteristic precision. The bridge would not extract anything. It would observe. It would trace the active pathways of his harmonic signature, the channels his mind used when it was creating, and map the architecture of them. Not the content, the structure. The way a cartographer maps a river system without needing to catalog every pebble on the riverbed. It will not feel like anything is being taken, she had said. It may feel like remembering. He had asked, will it hurt? She had tilted her head in the way he now recognized as serious consideration. It will not hurt in the way a physical wound hurts, but it will require you to be very present. The bridge cannot read a defended mind. If you block the pathways, the calibration will be incomplete. And incomplete means the bridge functions at partial capacity. It will still bridge, but it will miss the frequencies that matter most, the deep ones, the ones that hold what you have not been holding. She paused. The bridge needs what you have been keeping in the wall. He had not said anything for a while. Then, how does it know about the wall? The wall is visible in the harmonic signature, she said. A large organized absence is not the same as natural silence. The bridge can see the shape of what is not there. He lay now with that knowledge and the light above him and the hum. He thought about what was required of him, nothing specific, nothing strategic. Just to not hide, to not maintain the wall, to let the machine go where it needed to go and to follow it honestly. It was harder than anything he had done in a long time. Not because of pain. There was no pain. It was harder because of what was on the other side of the wall. The moment on the road, the rain on the broken glass, the gray face in the hospital, the unfinished argument, the studio he hadn't gone back to, the brushes wrapped in cloth that smelled like her. All the mornings of the last 17 months, gray and sealed and waiting. And harder still because he knew, now, that the wall had not been protecting him. He had been operating for 17 months on the belief that if he took the wall down he would simply be demolished. That grief without the wall was grief without floor or ceiling, an infinite falling. But in the days he had spent on the station, something had shifted in his thinking, and what he understood now, imperfectly, approximately, the way a translation node renders nuance, was that the wall was not keeping the grief contained. The wall was keeping everything contained, both the grief and everything that could grow alongside it. He let the machine in. It began at the edges, the way light enters a room when someone opens a door slightly, not fully, not yet, but enough to see the shape of the space. He felt it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm, not the storm itself, but the knowledge that the storm is real and approaching, and the time for pretending otherwise has passed. Then it went deeper. He felt the painting first. Not the paintings on the walls of the new studio, not the alien pigment canvas in his room, but the earliest painting he could remember making, a child's watercolor of his grandmother's garden, the flowers slightly wrong in proportion, the sun in the corner that every child draws because the sun belongs in every scene. The warmth of that memory was intact, undamaged, perfectly preserved. He had not touched it in years, but it had not gone anywhere. Then the next paintings, the student work, the failures, the first real piece that had surprised him, the one he'd stood in front of and thought, yes, that is what I was trying to say, the feeling of a thing finally landing. Then Marta. Not all at once. In sequence, the way a story is told, beginning to end, no chapters skipped. Their first conversation, which had been an argument about whether a particular painting in a gallery in Krakow was technically accomplished or genuinely felt, and he had said technically accomplished, and she had said both, obviously, and he had looked at it again and realized she was right. How he had gone back the following week to look at it again without her present, and stood there for 20 minutes accepting that he had missed something and she had seen it, and that this meant he wanted to talk to her again, immediately. The 3 years, the Saturday mornings, the smell of her studio, the way she hummed while she worked, the same 4-bar melody he had apparently now adopted as his own, the one he hummed when anxious, which he had not realized until Irea mentioned it and then understood completely. He had been carrying her humming as his own without knowing. And the night before the accident, the argument, he felt the whole of it now, with the wall down, not with horror, not with the crushing guilt he had been maintaining it with, but clearly and precisely. They had argued about something stupid, and she had been right, and he had known it even at the time and had not conceded because he was tired, and it seemed small enough to be fixed tomorrow. There had been no tomorrow. He had been carrying that for 17 months as the defining fact of their relationship. The last thing, the unresolved last thing, and no ability to resolve it, and the wall built around it to prevent him from having to feel the full weight of it. But lying in the dark with the machine reading the architecture of his grief, he saw what he had not allowed himself to see. The argument was the last thing, but it was not the whole thing. It was 3 years of Saturday mornings and paint-stained hands, and a woman who had looked at his unfinished work and said, "You make the unreal feel true," and had meant it with her whole attention. It was 3 years of being accurately seen. It was 3 years of arguing about paintings in galleries and being made to look again and finding she was right. It was the way she organized her studio, everything labeled, the meticulous handwriting that still existed on those labels in the storage unit he hadn't opened. And the fact that the handwriting still existed meant that she still existed in the things she had touched and named, and the wall had been keeping him from that too. The grief was enormous. It was as large as he had been afraid it was. But it was not larger than him. That was the thing he had not known until now. He had been afraid it was larger than him, and so he had walled it off to avoid finding out. But in the chamber, with the wall down and the machine tracing every pathway, he found that grief at full scale was survivable. It was not comfortable. It was not resolved. It was the size it was going to be for the rest of his life, enormous and specific and not going anywhere. But he was still here. And in the space where the grief was the raw, walled-off, 17-month-old grief, there was also the painting he'd made in his room, the one of Marta that wasn't Marta, the feeling of Saturday mornings in oil and unfamiliar pigment. The two things were not separate. They had never been separate. He had been keeping them apart through enormous effort, enormous daily effort, because he was afraid that if he stopped he would lose both, the capacity to feel and the capacity to create, both at once, and have nothing. But they were not at war with each other. They were the same thing. The grief was the painting. The painting was the grief. The love was in both, and neither one canceled the other, and you could hold them simultaneously without either one destroying you. He understood, lying in that chamber in the dark, what Irea had meant when she said the Ketsolari couldn't do this. It was not a skill. It was a decision. A terrifying, ongoing, very human decision to not choose between feeling and making, to let them coexist, to build from the rubble rather than clearing it away. The machine read all of it. When he came out, 4 hours and 19 minutes later, Irea was waiting in the corridor outside. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Well," he said. Her bioluminescent ridge was lit from base to crown. He had never seen it do that before. "The bridge activated," she said. "For the first time in 300 years it activated." He leaned against the wall. His legs were uncertain. She stepped forward without any ceremony and let him lean against her instead, which he did, because it seemed natural, and because the wall he'd been maintaining for 17 months had just been fully disassembled, and he was not sure yet what he was made of without it. "Okay," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood there for a while. He spent another week on the station. Not because he was required to, the conditions of his agreement had been met, he was free to go, but because there was still the matter of the bridge's first real test, and he found he wanted to see it. He also found, if he was being precise with himself, that he was not entirely ready to go back. Not because the station had become preferable to Earth, but because going back now, after the chamber, after the wall being down, required him to do something he had been postponing for 17 months, and doing it required more momentum than he could generate standing still. Adriana had understood this without being told. On the morning after the reading, she had appeared at his door with 2 cups of something the Kethsolari heated that was not coffee but performed the same function, and she had sat across from him without speaking for a while, and then had said, "You look like someone who just discovered the wall was holding up less than they thought." "Yes," he said. "Good," she handed him the cup. "The wall was always the problem." "I know that now." "You knew it before. Knowing and accepting are different problems." She looked at him with the frank assessment that he had come to recognize as her default mode, not unkind, but unwilling to soften things unnecessarily. "What will you do when you go back?" "The storage unit," he said. "Marta's things." "Yes." "And the studio," he looked at the cup. "I'm going to get a studio." She was quiet for a moment. Then she would be glad, for what it's worth from a stranger. He looked at her. "How do you know what she would think?" "Because you've been describing her for a week, and she sounds like someone who would be very glad." She took a sip of the not coffee. "She also sounds like someone who would think this entire situation was simultaneously the most extraordinary and most predictable thing that ever happened to you. A painter abducted by aliens to help calibrate an empathy engine." She gestured at the station around them. She would say, "Of course it was you." He thought about it. He thought about Marta looking at his unfinished paintings and saying, "You make the unreal feel true." "Yes," he said quietly. She would say that. The first test was between 2 Kethsolari and a pair of Vathamara, a species whose last diplomatic interaction with the consortium had ended in what was delicately described as a significant kinetic event 3 years prior. They sat in the bridge chamber, the same chamber Adam had lain in 2 pairs, and the bridge transmitted. Adam watched from the observation window. What happened was not dramatic. No one wept. No one embraced. What happened was that 2 Kethsolari and 2 Vathamara sat across a table from each other and were quiet for approximately 40 minutes, and then the lead Vathamara said something to the lead Kethsolari, and the lead Kethsolari said something back, and they shook hands, or performed their species equivalent. It was gentle and inconclusive, and looked like nothing. Irea told him afterward that in the 40 minutes of bridge transmission, each pair had experienced a curated excerpt of the other's foundational grief, the loss that had shaped their civilization's assumptions, the specific texture of what they were protecting when they refused to give ground. "It did not make them agree," she said. "It made them understand why the other refuses to agree. That is different. Different enough. Different enough to stop shooting each other." She paused, "which is, I think, the first step." He thought about that. "I've had arguments like that," he said, "where I suddenly understood why the other person was wrong in the way they were wrong, and somehow that made it possible to stop." "Yes," she looked at him. "You already knew this. Your species already knows this individually. You practice it with each other. You have not yet found a way to do it at scale." "We're working on it." "I know." She almost smiled, her equivalent, the slight ridge flicker. "That is, I think, the most human sentence I have heard." On the last morning, real morning, because they had oriented one of the viewports to track Earth's day cycle for his benefit, he stood at the window and looked at it again. Small and blue and improbably beautiful, the planet he'd grown up on. The country inside it where his sister was, with his brushes in a cloth in a storage box. The city inside that where Marta's studio was, the labels in her handwriting. He thought about the storage unit. He thought about Velthari. The things that remain unfinished not because we failed but because time refused us. He would go there. He decided it clearly, standing at the window for the first time in 17 months, deciding something that was not about maintenance or survival but about actually going somewhere. The studio, the boxes, the handwriting. He would paint again. He knew that now the way he knew his own name, not as a resolution, not as a plan, but as a fact about himself that had always been true and had simply been inaccessible for a while. Irea appeared behind him. She stood at a respectful distance. She had been doing that this last week, maintaining whatever proximity he required, no more. It was one of the things he had noticed about her. She understood space, both the physical kind and the other kind. "Your transport is ready," she said. He turned around. "The consortium vote concluded this morning," she said. "The Concordat will extend recognition to Earth within 40 of your years. The formal delegation will take longer, there are processes, but the decision is made." She paused. "Your species is no longer alone." He let that land. 40 years was a long time. It was also not that long in the scale of the thing. "I won't be here for it," he said. "No," she paused. "But the people who will be here for it will have a world that was ready for them, partly because of what you did. That is not nothing." He looked at her. In the light from the viewport, her bioluminescent ridge was doing the low, steady glow that he had come to understand as contentment. Her triple-lensed eyes held him with that quality of full presence that he'd stopped finding disconcerting and started finding grounding. "The other thing you said," he said, "the children." She was quiet for a moment. The genetic reading was completed as part of the bridge calibration. The contribution is made. It is not, the process is not what you might imagine. There is no additional involvement required. She paused carefully. "I did not explain this clearly at the beginning. I should have. So they will exist. In time, they will carry your harmonic signature alongside mine. They will be able to do what you do, hold grief and beauty simultaneously, and they will be able to do what I do. They will be, if the theory holds, the kind of minds that can build bridges and feel what crosses them." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to be present for it. I am not asking you to change your life. I am telling you, as I told you before, the truth of it, because you deserve the truth." He stood with that for a while. It was, he realized, the strangest and most specific thing that had ever happened to him. Stranger than the abduction, stranger than the station, stranger than lying in the dark while a machine read the interior of his grief. Children somewhere in the future who would be half him, half this tall, bioluminescent architect who had told him the truth about everything, because she found dishonesty did not suit her. He thought about what Marta used to say, "You make the unreal feel true." Maybe that was not just a thing you did on canvas. Maybe that was the whole job. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest." "Thank you," she said, "for the same." He turned back to the viewport one more time. Earth, small and bright. The storage unit in Warsaw, the studio with Marta's labels, the brushes in their cloth. "Will I hear from you again?" he said. "The consortium's communication array will be extended to include human frequencies within 8 of your years. After that, yes." She paused. "I will send something when they are born, if you wish to receive it." "Send it." He picked up the pack they had prepared for him. The pigments, the strange substrates, the materials from another sky. He slung it over his shoulder the way he had once slung his supply bag on the way to the studios in Krakow, before Marta, before everything, when the world was simply the unfinished painting in front of him, and his only job was to begin. He turned from the window and walked toward the transport bay. He was already planning the first canvas. 8 years later, in the studio he had eventually rented in Warsaw, not Marta's old studio, a new one, though he had gone to Marta's studio and stood in it for an afternoon and been glad of it. Adam Nowicki received a transmission. It was not in Polish. It was not in any language his translation node could fully render. It arrived as a harmonic pattern, a resonant signature, the kind he now understood the Kethsolari used to communicate the things that words could not carry, the kind you felt more than heard. He stood in his studio, surrounded by canvases that held, each of them, that specific impossible combination of grief and beauty, and the ongoing fact of being alive. He stood there and he received the signal. And what it said, translated approximately, inadequately, beautifully, was, they are here, they arrived, they can already do both. He set down his brush. He sat down in the chair by the window, the one that caught the morning light. He pressed his hands against his knees and looked at nothing for a while. Then quietly, in a voice addressed to no one he could point to and everyone he would always carry, he said, "You were right. The unreal can be made to feel true. I just had to remember how." Outside, Warsaw went on being Warsaw, trams and cafes and arguments and music drifting from an open window 2 streets over. All the human texture of it, the insistence, the refusal to be quiet, the stubbornness of continuing. On a station 40 light minutes away, the empathy bridge hummed. 47 species, almost making themselves understood. The age of miracles had been selling itself short. It was only just beginning.